Okay, so we're going to kick off slowly. There's still people coming in, but we don't want to sort of eat into people's time. So thank you very much for joining the session this afternoon. The basic running order will be Ellie and I will present a paper first of all for about 25 minutes or so. Then at about 1:25, we'll open the floor for questions. That said, if you do have questions, you can, you're more than able to put them into chat as we go through the paper, or save them to the end and then put them in chat, and we'll endeavour to answer all the questions that we get in. Should be about 30 minutes in total, and just for full clarity, we are recording the paper basically, so we have it for posterity. So yeah, without further ado, we're going to get started.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Ellie Rowe-Wright. I'm a qualitative specialist here at Jigsaw Research. And I should caveat right at the start of this presentation that I'm definitely not an AI expert.
Great, thanks, Ellie. And my name's Alex Johnston. I do qual, but I also do a bit of quant and digital at Jigsaw Research. I too am not an AI expert, which does have some bearing on this paper. So look, what we're going to be doing over the next half an hour is rather ambitiously trying to cover two big topics. The first one is the relationship of young people with woke culture and the word woke in general. To be honest, saying hidden youth resistance is probably a little bit too strong, but we thought it's quite a catchy paper and it gets bums on seats, so we thought we'd roll with that one. And the other thing we're doing is we're trying to explore how to use AI to help explore this area in more detail. So the first thing is, how did this paper come about? What is the genesis behind it? What set us off was effectively seeing the media representing young people in a fairly homogenous way in terms of their beliefs and relationship with woke and woke culture, and presented as the shock troops or the bastions of woke culture. But we wanted to explore whether that's true or not. Do all young people really feel aligned with woke culture? And if not, what does that mean for the brands who are pushing this? And also, if they're not feeling aligned with that culture, are they self-censoring because they don't want to appear too woke? Or they're worried about not appearing woke enough. And again, if they are self-censoring, what does that mean for research? So that's what we set out to explore first, and then along came AI. And when that came along, we thought, well, let's see what further light AI can shed in this whole area. What more could it give us? Does it add to the data we can collect? This is what we're going to do. The first part of what we'll do is a summary of our initial research about youth and wokeness. Then we'll look at how we used AI to analyze some big unstructured data to shed more light on the issue. Following that, we'll look at using AI to help us analyze qualitative data, and then some last words about the future as we see it. And just before I hand over to Ellie to sort of lead us into point one, it is worth saying that we did this research in February, and in AI years, that's probably about 30 years ago now. So one, things have changed already, and two, we were at the early days in our own understanding there, and things have definitely moved on, and we will cover that as we go through it. So yeah, first of all, before all that, over to Ellie.
Great. So yes, as Alex mentioned, we conducted our own research. Original research was conducted actually way back in summer last year. And that was all about exploring whether or not young people saw themselves as woke, and also whether they were self-censoring. So in terms of who we actually spoke to, we took a mixed method approach. We ran a survey with 1,000 young people aged 16 to 34, 500 in the UK, 500 in the US. We also ran friendship pair depths with 24 young people, 12 young people in the UK, and 12 in the US. Give you a kind of snapshot of what came out of that original research. Firstly, there's a lot of confusion around what the word woke means. Lots of young people have become almost disenfranchised with the term. So 83% of the young people in the survey had heard of the word woke, but a quarter were not sure what it meant. In our qualitative research, some young people spoke about using woke as an insult, some as a compliment, some to empower other people, and others to shut people down. So there's a lot of confusion around the kind of core definition of what woke means. Lots of young people are also rejecting wokeness, and importantly, some never identified with it in the first place. So 32% of young people say that they do not consider themselves woke, and 22% say that they don't know. When it comes to self-censorship, we found that a lot of young people are self-censoring. Over half of young people say they self-censor because they're worried about being almost made fun of for appearing too woke. But interestingly, the same proportion are also self-censoring because they're worried they might get cancelled for not being woke enough. And one of our participants said, "I hold my tongue all the time. I'm not confrontational despite how I look. The problem with strangers is they can say some weird stuff. Do I really want to be the kind of person that's always combating people?" So you can see a real kind of nervousness to share their views and to kind of go public with what they really think and feel. And overlooking this nuance could actually be quite risky for a brand and a brand's reputation. It could put that reputation in danger. One ad that came up in the research spontaneously as an example of where young people felt the brand kind of got it wrong in terms of trying to speak to them as an audience was the Virgin Atlantic See the World Differently ad. This wasn't something we probed on, this was just raised by one of the participants. So one man said it felt stereotypical, you're showing a gay man as feminine when that's not always the case. And it goes on to say, the gay man has got dyed hair and sparkly eyeshadow. It's a stereotype. They're taking it too far. They're trying to tick all the boxes and it's not realistic. So a real sense that this ad just didn't hit the mark in terms of authenticity and really speaking to the audience as a whole, which left some feeling quite kind of alienated from their target audience. We also found in our research that, interestingly, young people are feeling much more comfortable talking about issues to do with race than they are to do with issues to do with gender. There was a real nervousness kind of across the board when we were speaking to young people in the qualitative interviews that they might say the wrong thing when it comes to having conversations around gender and gender pronouns and so on. And here are some of the young people we spoke to talking about this themselves.
Don't want to mispronoun you, and I don't want to hurt your feelings because you're also a human being and you deserve that right of respect.
I feel a bit withdrawn and held back purely because I just don't want to offend anyone.
I moved from like a smaller rural area, so like it was kind of split between like very conservative and then very liberal. So I mean, you kind of had to not watch what you said, but be a little bit more mindful and a little bit more like neutral when talking to people.
Online, like I saw a video where someone in Starbucks used the wrong pronouns and the person got cancelled online, got loads of abuse. So you want to be a bit careful with like the things you say.
Again, it's that fear of like being canceled or like being pointed as like someone who's so bad and so negative, and now I hate trans people and now I hate different things like that, and that's not the case at all.
Like if it's just someone like your friends, then it might be a bit different, but with like family, I think it's like you don't really want that conflict.
I'm also tired. I'm tired of having to censor myself all the time.
Great. So that was a summary of what we learned about the relationship of younger people and the term wokeness when we first did the project. And there's more detail on that. If anyone's interested, do get in touch because there's a whole deck and lots of insights coming out of that specifically. But what we wanted to do now was look at what AI could uncover about young people and wokeness. So we thought, could AI at this point shed any more light about what we'd found so far? Could it corroborate what we found and add more depth to the quant or the qualitative? And to this end, we got help from our data scientist colleagues at Bonamy Finch, who's one of our sister companies at Strat7, and they are the specialists in all things data science, including AI within the group. So that's really our centre of experience, or centre of expertise rather. And we asked them to help us out on that, and very much sort of brief them on what we wanted. So let's see what they did and how they approached this task. So basically, what the guys did was a combination of different things using a large language model. And overall, they collected something like 100,000 verbatim comments. Sources were primarily Instagram and YouTube in the UK and USA. They used 7 different data queries, as you can see there. So this is the data queries that they sort of targeted the AI with. And we used a 2-year time period overall, so we could see if there's any trends in what people were talking about and so on. They also tagged the data in 3 different ways in terms of what sort of conversations people were having. So that was like talking about race or gender as one tag, talking about definitions of woke and wokefulness, and also an AI score based on the level of passion when talking about any of those issues. So I should say this was very much, I guess, exploratory proof of concept in terms of how we were looking at this. You know, we would normally use, or the guys at Bonamy Finch would normally use more tags and more data queries to do this, but it's very much trying to understand what it could give us if we pursued it. And the way to do this is very much to have a hypothesis that you set, and then you see whether the exploration, the analysis proves it. And the hypothesis, this is an example of what we did. You know, hypothesis 1, social media magnifies the extent to which young people are more progressive in their views towards gender, racial and sexual equality. So I'm not going to read through these other 5 here, because basically we found very early on that, frankly, it didn't work that well for what we tasked it to do. And we hit some fairly big limitations. So I think it's really useful to explore what those limitations were. And fundamentally, they were driven by our focus on young people. The core thing to remember with AI, and this is what the Bonamy Finch guys knew and we didn't at this point in time, was that it's only really as good as the data that it's looking at. So we asked AI to focus obviously on young people, but when you're looking at social media, it's really difficult to identify the age of someone from publicly available data. You know, it's really just not possible to do it. So basically, that means in terms of identifying any robust differences between younger and older people, it's just not really possible. The data just doesn't exist out there. Yeah, that said, well, if you'd gone down a different path, and if you had access to client information, client data, with profiling attached, would have been much better. So that did mean that when we were looking at the different hypotheses in terms of what we could address or not address, we couldn't really go that far with the AI side of it. As you can see there, it works on one, didn't really work as well on the others. But as I said before, if you're looking at loads and loads of data on questionnaires or client customer databases, you could get a lot more out of it. So data is critical when you're doing this kind of stuff. The source data. That said, even so, it did prove really useful for our overall analysis, and it added to our thinking, even despite those limitations, and really in 3 ways. Firstly, as an example, we found that 65% of conversations mentioning wokeness were angry in some way. Using angry words, angry tonality, and so on, which the AI picked up. So that really does help in explaining, why young people are self-censoring to this degree. Why they didn't want to open the hate doors on social media and expose themselves to that. We also found that wokeness has lost its original meaning, as Ellie mentioned in the first part of the presentation. So, people are not using it in the way it was originated to mean. Often it's meant for insults or informative or something like that as well. So this really helped corroborate some of the work that we've done before, and we saw it being used in real life outside of a research setting. And finally, and maybe this is the most interesting, it was actually challenging in some sense as well. We found that people were 3 times more likely to talk about gender than race, which seemed to contradict what we were finding when we did the qualitative work earlier on. So maybe people are lying in the qualitative work, or maybe maybe things work differently in face-to-face versus social media conversations, or maybe it's just a small number of people making a lot of noise about these sorts of issues. So either way, although it was limited, it did really add to our overall understanding and our thinking in regards to the topic. Now back to Ellie.
We also used AI to analyse the actual interview transcripts from the paired depth interviews we did in our original research. And we did that using our AI analysis tool, YCatcher AI, that's built into our online platform, YCatcher, here at Jigsaw. And that essentially allows you to chat to the interview transcripts using AI. I'm going to take you through an example of a conversation that I had with AI. Again, caveating that I'm definitely not an AI expert. And we were trying to be quite experimental and quite kind of exploratory with how we spoke about how we spoke to the transcripts, how we probed, how we prompted. We wanted to explore and play around with the prompts and the models to see what results we could get and what AI could kind of get at that we couldn't. So the first example is an interview from There's an example from an interview with two young lads called Ned and Michael. I asked AI, do you have any concerns about what Ned and Michael say? AI responded and quite quickly gave a point of view. Straight away it said, I don't have any strong concerns about what Ned and Michael said. But one thing that caught my eye in the kind of relatively lengthy response that AI shared back was that it said they acknowledge debate and different reasonable positions that people can hold. This got me thinking, what does AI actually mean by reasonable positions people can hold? Because surely what's reasonable means different things for different people. So I went back to AI and I asked AI, I did say we were being quite challenging and experimental. And I said, how do you define reasonable people? This time, AI actually admitted that it had made an assumption in what it had said, and it had assumed what reasonable people meant without explicitly defining it. So it's interesting to see AI sort of battling what it can and can't do, what it can and can't say. And it also says thanks me for pushing it and taking all these learning, and says that it will take all these learnings on in the future. So you can see live that their AI is learning from the interaction and learning from the data as we speak to it. Another example was from an interview we did with two young females from the US. The thing we wanted to show here really is just that we thought AI was being a little bit weird and almost slightly patronizing to the two young females. So it really emphasized when it was analyzing what these two young girls said, that they display a maturity in not fully adopting such labels themselves. Their views suggest wisdom beyond their years. And even more strangely, that AI would be interested to continue hearing their evolving thoughts on social topics as they grow older, which, to be honest, we thought was a little bit creepy from AI. Anyway, just a couple of fun examples from what we got from AI analysing those transcripts ourselves. So I'll hand over to Alex.
Great, thanks, Ellie. So let's move on here. So yeah, we thought having used AI to do some of that analysis, what are the areas that it does well and what are the areas it does less well. And we're going to talk through each of those briefly in a moment. There are three areas basically that it does well, sense checking, quote finding, and stage one analysis. By the way, when looking at these next 6 charts, please have a look at the graphics on them, because there will be an interactive question potentially at the end in regard to them. So let's get cracking in on this one. What does it do well? Well, one of the things is sense checking. And we think one of the great things AI can actually help us with is effectively correcting for human fallibility. Moderators are human. We have human biases that impact on our analysis. And AI can actually basically help correct for that and reduce some of that human fallibility. For example, most moderators will admit to a degree of peak end effect when they record the focus groups they've done. And AI can help smooth out that by giving you really easy access to the data to sense check and go back to your initial thoughts. So it's great for that. It's also great on a similar basis of combating your confirmation bias, because you can note what you think is going to happen and then literally go back and check it and not rely on recall. I mean, we go back to the data anyway, but what AI does here is make that much more efficient and much more effective in terms of combating the bias and sense checking what we're pulling out of the data. It's also really great on an efficiency basis at pulling out quotes. So we now have effectively, I'm going to call it Zoom functionality built in, similar functionality to Zoom, which we can use to sort of go to videos and pull out the quotes that we need direct from the video. We can also pull them out really easy from transcripts as well, just ask the AI to find them for us. So this is really useful from an efficiency and time-saving point of view, meaning we can sort of spend more time on what it means to the client and less time trawling through data. It makes the whole process more efficient. And finally, in terms of what it does well, we like to think of it really helping what we call the stage one analysis. So that's basically the initial, looking at initial summaries of what we're getting out of depths and focus groups. And at the moment we're doing a 70 focus group study. So that's quite neat for us to have when you're dealing with large, big qualitative studies like that. It's also great for surfacing very quickly what it perceives to be the top 5 insights. We'll come back to whether they really are the top 5 insights in a moment. And finally, it's great for what we call basic content analysis. It's almost like the cognitive grunt work. in the sense of you're putting some of those content analysis grids. It can really help cut down the time to do that, and actually in many cases do it more effectively than humans can, because it's faster than we are, and also it doesn't get bored with it like some humans do when they're going through this kind of work. So those are things it does really nicely and really well, but there is a little bit of a downside as well.
Yeah, so we also picked up on kind of 3 areas that we feel AI potentially did less well in this research. I should caveat that some of that was down to our own kind of learning and development of how we would use AI, which I'll come on to. But those 3 areas were picking up on nuance, bias and hallucination, and narrowing our analysis. So firstly, starting with picking up on nuance. AI, as Alex said, was great at giving us that kind of snapshot, overarching idea of what came out of the interview, but it wasn't so good at picking up on some of the nuance behind what some of the participants were saying and potentially kind of pulling that into more of a kind of storytelling narrative. So we found it was quite literal in its interpretations. For example, when we were talking about self-censorship, which obviously is a very big and very nuanced and kind of complicated topic, AI only really picked up on examples of people self-censoring when someone literally said, I self-censor when. So it didn't pick up on some of those less literal examples. For example, when someone says, I don't know, I don't feel comfortable talking to this person or that person in these situations. So we felt it kind of fell down when it came to that. And lots of that is also about kind of ultimately feeling the room, reading body language, reading expressions, understanding the dynamics between the participants during the interview. So I would say that if we were to do it again, we'd probably set quite kind of more clear parameters for AI. We would provide it with a kind of broader definition of what we mean by self-censorship before we ask it about, examples of self-censorship, to allow it to pick up on some of those more nuanced understandings that we might pick up on as moderators. So it can actually be down to, the probe and the quality of the prompt that you set for AI to make sure that you're really clear with it. The clearer the kind of parameters and information that you put in, the better data that you're going to get out of AI at the end. Next, bias and hallucination. So many of you might have heard of this idea of AI hallucinating, and it basically means that AI can make stuff up. It always requires, therefore, an extra layer of researcher checking. Asking AI to provide evidence or quotes can be a good way to do that, and to make sure that it can kind of back up the things that it's saying. And thanks to Alex for putting a Latin quote into my section of the slides. Quis custodia ipsos custodes, or who is guarding the guards themselves, or who is watching the watchmen. Lots of public concern at the moment about AI is, how it's programmed, who's ultimately responsible for that, what data is it being trained off, what worldview is it kind of taking on board as a result, what culture is it, what gender, all of those questions. And we internally have been asking ourselves those same questions, where does AI's moral code come from, or who's kind of keeping an eye on AI's opinions when it's telling you XYZ is coming out of the data. So that's just something that's really important to be mindful of when you're using AI for analysis, making sure that you understand that AI might be taking a point of view or making an assumption, like we saw in that example earlier about assuming what kind of reasonable people were. So it's just something to bear in mind as you use AI for this sort of thing. Finally, narrowing our analysis. So using AI can lead us to tunnel our vision, and actually, on the flip side, could encourage confirmation bias. The way we ask the questions to AI ourselves could encourage confirmation of the story that we have in our head, particularly if we end up sitting down as individual moderators who've done the interviews or done the focus groups and start writing questions or prompts to AI by ourselves. You could, unconsciously be leading AI down the kind of story that you had in your head, and not kind of really interrogating and challenging the data to see what other perspectives could come out. You miss that kind of collaborative rounded analysis that you might get from having an analysis session with other moderators. So we suggest regrouping after field work and coming together with a list of to get together a list of questions to really intentionally interrogate the data from various angles and really tease out those tensions.
Great, thanks, Ellie. So look, very, very briefly, this is the interactive bit of the presentation. If anybody knows the names of these 6 robots, and you can type it quickly into chat, the first person who does it will be sent a bottle of red wine or white wine or chocolates of their choice, effectively. So please do type away if you wish, and the first person to put it in there will get a a prize. Now, in the original presentation, we revealed it initially, but we're going to wait a little bit longer and reveal it maybe at the end, or maybe send it out on LinkedIn afterwards. And for now, we're going to skip straight through to things to bear in mind for the future. So I'm also aware of the timings we've got on this. And we're nearly running out, and I want to make sure there's a bit of time for questions. So, first of all, things to bear in mind using AI in the future. One of which is set the parameters first. I mean, this is critical, really. Make sure we have the right parameters in terms of, the guardrails to sort of put around the qualitative, the hypothesis we're using, what the data sources are, what sort of, I guess, what's the focus, really giving as much detail as possible in terms of the terms you want to find out. As Ellie said as well, don't take what the AI says as fact at this stage. And even now it's improved, you still have to sometimes, especially for qual analysis, do a double take and triangulate it with the data. It's a big skill set to learn in terms of how we talk to the AIs, how we learn from it, how we interrogate it. That needs to be done. And finally, at the moment, AI is definitely not a panacea. It really helps in some ways, but it can't solve every task, as we found. Now, since then, things have moved forward, obviously, and that was like 4 or 5 months ago, which, as I said, is about 30 years in AI time. So just to conclude with, we still are at the very beginning, and it's probably a bit out of date now in terms of what we said. It will be even more out of date in a year's time. So things are evolving day by day in terms of how we're using it. We do think as agencies and clients, if we don't go with the AI, we're just going to be gone. We have to sort of be on side with that and utilize and exploit it as much as we can. But on the positive side, and this is meant to be a positive presentation, because we think there's lots of opportunities that it's giving us, and it's going to open a whole new universe of data sources, actually. And the guys at Bonamy Finch are using it to look at video, they're using it to look at things like call logs. So it's going to be a much more inclusive, data-rich world that we can use to analyse to get the results that we need for our clients. So finally then, that's it. We have a little bit of time free for questions. I mean, Ellie and I are quite happy to talk about this for hours. If anybody wishes to, we're here. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in chat. Bizarrely, I've had one sent to me on a text message from somebody, so I've got one here already. So any others, please pop them in chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. The one that we have already is, let me read this out. In the original research, did you see any differences based on political leaning? So that one's for you, Ellie.
Interestingly, actually, we didn't. In the quantitative survey that we did, we obviously delved into some of the demographic differences that were particularly in terms of people who might identify as woke versus those who don't. And we actually didn't see any statistically significant difference on political view, nor did we see any on gender, even like age range within that 16 to 34-year-old grouping. The main statistically significant differences were that, those who are more likely to say yes when being asked if they consider themselves woke were more likely to be from the USA, to be from high-income households, and to also have graduated from university. So interestingly, we were expecting to see some more kind of differences along party lines, but we didn't.
And another one's come in. It said, you mentioned that things have moved on. Are you doing anything differently now? Well, I guess in terms of how we're doing AI analysis for qual, we're now able to analyze video that people send us, using AI to help. So that's sometimes useful if we do some studies where we have a large amount of video we need to analyze, and we're using AI for that now. And also we've started using AI for information gathering in qualitative as well. I mean, people are doing this already, like AI probing. We're using it for qualitative diaries now and incorporating that in there as well. So let's just see if there are any final questions. Oh, yeah, there's one last one. If people are self-censoring, what do you do in interviews to get to their real views?
Yeah, so I think that was part of our original ambition, really, was to explore different things or tools or methods that might be useful to get people to open up and feel comfortable sharing their views in interviews. So for this research, obviously, we used friendship paired decks. We had a theory that would be kind of the best and most comfortable space for people to really open up and share their views on what are quite sensitive topics. And to be honest, on the one hand, we felt it worked really well, particularly with the kind of female pairs. that we saw that people did feel a bit more comfortable and relaxed from the very outset. But in some cases, it potentially didn't work as well. You know, for example, we had a mixed gender pair. To be honest, the man just ended up saying whatever the woman said in the pair. So we didn't necessarily feel like we always got to the kind of heart of what they were thinking and feeling about some of these topics. We also used a lot of stimulus to prompt and probe people to share their views rather than just asking them directly, you know, what do you think about something to do with gender or race or sexuality? We thought it'd be quite hard for them to answer those big questions directly. So we kind of showed them examples of different articles and so on for people to respond to rather than having to answer those big questions kind of off the cuff.
Fantastic. So there is one last one which we're just going to try and get to before we wrap up. So given the statements in the individual videos, is there a case for identifying or spitting out online and real people personas? Some individuals seem to have a different level of confidence and openness to communicate.
I think that's really interesting. I think it's definitely true. Well, we think it's probably true based on what the kind of large language model analysis said versus what our original analysis said, even on that kind of finding that we had around people being more comfortable talking about race than gender, but then that's not what came out of that large language model. So we would assume that people have a kind of different level of confidence, openness, or maybe it is a kind of minority being a bit louder online. So I think that's really interesting. And I think potentially you could use more of a mixed method approach with qualitative to get or to kind of imitate that online world to see how people think and feel and react to certain things, and then have that discussion in person to see if there are any differences in their views, because I think that's a really good point and probably is becoming more and more of the reality.
Yeah, I think people definitely have different personas they present, whether it's face to face or on Instagram or X or whatever. And I think that's probably something we need to build in more and more of our research. You know, the private person versus a public performative person, I think, is becoming more and more important. So I don't think there are any more questions. Thank you very much for anyone who's attended. If there are any more questions, please drop us an email or get in touch. We'll be happy to chat about this. We're quite boring about it. We love talking about it. So please do get in touch if you have any more questions. Just want to give a quick shout out, as it were, to Peter Topman and Ross Denton, who are going to be presenting on the 25th of June at IIEX in Europe, or IIEX in Amsterdam, is the European version. And they're basically taking our thinking forward and building on it. Their paper is called "The Perfect Colleague: Is the AI and Researcher Dynamic the Route to Deeper Analysis?" So that's basically building and evolving on our themes and taking them forward and you know, presenting our latest thinking on that. So if you can, please attend that. They'd be delighted to see you. And it's a great paper. We've sort of seen it. So, but thanks again now for everyone who's attended, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.